The train came and went, and all it left behind was the ghost of its whistle and a cloud of dust. At the edge of the prairie, the station's boards were gray and tired. On a creaking bench sat a woman and a child, both so thin you could count their ribs through their clothes. The woman, Millie, held her shoulders straight, but her dress was torn at the hem and her will was frayed even worse. The little girl, Cora, no older than 5, squeezed her mother's hand, her eyes huge with a hunger that was older than she was. Leaning against a post was a man, Houston. His face looked like it was carved from stone and silence. He'd spent 34 years alone, and it had worn all the softness off him. But he watched the woman and her child. He watched them with a weight in his eyes he couldn't hide. He'd seen hardship before. He'd seen families break on the sharp edge of this land. But the hollows in that little girl's cheeks, they stirred something in him he didn't want stirred. Around them, whispers flew like wasps. 2 women on a bench, their eyes narrowed. "No husband," one said, "just shows up, bold." A man spat tobacco juice in the dirt. "Ought to keep to her own kind. This ain't no place for beggars." Every word was a tiny, sharp knife. Millie stood taller, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her daughter's hand. The shame was a physical thing, pressing down on her like the sun. But she would not lower her head. She would not. Cora, small and trembling, tugged on her mother's skirt. "Mama," she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "I'm hungry." Millie bent down, her hands shaking as she smoothed the girl's hair. "Hush now, little one," she said, but her own throat was a desert. Then the man, Houston, pushed off the post. His boots hit the wooden platform with a heavy, measured beat. He walked to the little window where they sold stale food, slapped a coin on the counter, and took a piece of cornbread wrapped in paper. He didn't say a word. He just walked over and set the bread on the bench beside them. He never quite met Millie's eyes. Her lips parted. Pride and anger fought a war on her cheeks. "We didn't ask for your charity," she said, her voice stiff as a board. But her hand, it trembled. It wanted to reach for that bread. All the same, Houston's voice was low and rough, like stones rolling downhill. It held no judgment, just fact. "The little one needs it." That's all he said. He turned and walked back to his post, his gaze fixed on the endless prairie grass. The child reached first. Of course she did. Her tiny fingers tore into the bread, crumbs falling like sad little seeds. She ate like a starving wolf, then held the last piece up to her mother. Her eyes were serious, insistent. Millie's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. She took the last piece, her hands shaking so hard she could barely hold it. The taste was relief and poison all at once. Relief for the food that filled the aching hole in her gut. Poison for the pride it cost her. She risked a glance at the silent man. His face was a mask, unreadable. The whispers started again, sharper this time. "She'll be in the saloon by week's end," one of the women hissed. "A woman alone like that, she don't last long out here." Every sentence was another twist of the knife. Millie pulled Cora closer, trying to shield her with her own body from a world that was all teeth and claws. The sun began to dip, painting long, lonely shadows across the platform. Cora leaned against her, exhausted, the last crumbs still on her lips. Millie's heart was a cold, hard knot. They had no place to go, no home waiting, just an endless, empty prairie. Houston moved again. He straightened up from the post and walked toward them. His shadow fell over them first, long and dark. He crouched down, getting on the little girl's level. His voice, when it came, was softer than before. It was a secret, meant only for her. "Hush now, little one," he said. "I'll keep you both safe." The words hit Millie like a physical blow. She stared at him, searching his face for a trick, for the cruelty she knew had to be hiding there. But there was nothing, just steady eyes weathered by 1,000 lonely suns. He didn't say it like a promise. He said it like a fact, like the sun would rise tomorrow. Cora tilted her head, her tiny voice a question mark in the air. "Safe?" she asked. She said the word like she was trying to remember what it meant. Houston just nodded once. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of dust and coming rain. The last echo of the train was gone. Millie's heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and hope. She wanted to spit his words back in his face, to throw his charity on the ground. But the word, safe, it clung to her. It was a warmth she hadn't felt in a very, very long time. The platform was empty now, just the three of them under a vast, bruising sky. Millie looked at the horizon, a flat, endless line that promised nothing but more hardship. She hugged Cora tighter, feeling the tiny, frantic flutter of her daughter's heart against her own. Houston stood up, a dark silhouette against the dying sun. He tipped his hat, turned, and walked toward his horse without another word. He untied the reins, but he didn't get on. He just stood there, his hand on the saddle horn, and looked back at her. There was a question in his eyes, but his lips were a straight, silent line. Millie held her breath. The whole world seemed to hold its breath with her. She had a choice. Stay here, a beggar at the mercy of a cruel town, or follow this silent stranger into the unknown. Follow the man who had given her child bread and spoken of safety in a voice that held no lies. Cora tugged on her hand. Mama! Her eyes were fixed on the man and his horse. Millie swallowed the hard lump of her pride. The train was gone. The town was poison. And this man, this silent, unreadable man, was the only soul who had looked at her with something other than scorn. The sky bled from gold to purple. She bent and kissed Cora's hair, her eyes never leaving Houston. And in the silence between his waiting and her decision, something shifted, something fragile and dangerous and real. He didn't mount his horse. He just stood there, still as a statue, waiting, as if he knew this single moment would decide everything. The air itself felt heavy with the choice. Millie's feet felt rooted to the spot, but her heart was already walking toward him. The road from the station was a long, lonely ribbon of dust. Houston led the horse, and Millie walked beside it, one hand resting on Cora's small shoulder. Every step felt like a surrender. Every step felt like a rebellion. The prairie stretched out on all sides, a sea of grass swaying under a sky too big for any god. The silence between them was heavier than any conversation. Houston rode a few paces ahead, his back ramrod straight. His eyes were constantly moving, scanning the horizon with a watchfulness that seemed born into him. He didn't ask her questions. He didn't offer explanations. And that somehow was worse. It made the weight of his quiet charity feel unbearable. Her heart was a frantic bird in a cage, caught between the strange comfort of his strength and the sharp shame of her need. Cora stumbled. Her small legs were giving out. Millie scooped her up without a thought. The girl was light, too light, a little bundle of sticks in her arms. Houston stopped his horse. He looked down at them, his face giving nothing away. Then he swung out of the saddle. He held the reins out to Millie. Ride, he said. She's worn. Pride flared in her throat, hot and bitter. She opened her mouth to refuse, but Cora's head was already drooping against her shoulder, her breathing shallow with exhaustion. Millie pressed her lips together, took the reins, and climbed into the saddle with her daughter. The horse was warm and solid beneath them. Houston walked beside them, his stride long and even. He held the reins loosely in one hand. No man had ever done this for her, not without wanting something, not without a price hidden in the kindness. The unease in her chest grew sharper, a thorn twisting under her ribs. By the time the sun set the sky on fire, they arrived. It was a cabin, a solitary cabin in a field that was waiting for a plow. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney. It was a simple, weathered place, but it felt solid, cared for. Millie's breath caught in her throat as she slid down from the horse, still holding Cora. This wasn't an inn. This wasn't a temporary stop. This was his home. The moment she stepped inside, 1,000 new fears bloomed in the dark corners of her mind. The air inside smelled of wood smoke and old coffee. A fire glowed in the hearth. A rough wooden table stood in the center of the room, scarred by years of use. Houston moved with a quiet efficiency, setting out a basin of water for them to wash. He ladled beans and chunks of bread into 2 bowls from a pot simmering by the fire. He did it all without a word. Millie, stiff with a discomfort so deep it was almost painful, set Cora in a chair. The girl ate like she hadn't seen food in a year, her small face softening with every spoonful. Millie's own stomach was a tight, aching knot, but she could only manage a few bites. She was too aware of his eyes, too ashamed of her hunger under his roof. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the scrape of Cora's spoon against the bowl. When the silence became too much to bear, Millie set her bowl down. "What is it you want from us?" Her voice was quiet, but it was steady. Inside, she was trembling. No man gives something for nothing. Houston finally looked at her. His eyes were dark and steady in the flickering lamplight. "I want nothing." The words were rough, as if they didn't get used much, but they were firm. There was no lie in them, and that scared her more than anything. She studied him, looking for the trap. She knew men. She knew the way their promises were just bait on a hook. But he just sat there, his hands folded on the table, his face a roadmap of win and work. His stillness was more unsettling than any demand. That night he made a small cot for Cora by the hearth. He gave Millie a stack of neatly folded blankets, and he himself unrolled a bedroll by the front door, like a guard or a jailer. Millie lay awake long after Cora's breathing had evened out into the soft rhythm of sleep. She stared at the dying embers of the fire. The cabin walls felt strangely safe, but fear was a cold prickle on her skin. Safety always had a price. She just didn't know what it was yet. The next morning started with the sharp, rhythmic crack of an axe splitting wood. Houston was up before the sun, his movements precise and powerful. Millie, unsure of her place, found herself sweeping the porch, fetching water from the well. She watched Cora chase the chickens, and then she heard it, a sound she hadn't heard in months. Laughter. Her daughter's laughter. It was a small, bright thing, and it terrified her. Joy was an invitation for more pain. Joy made you attached, and attachment always led to loss. Later she saw him mending a leather harness, his large, rough hands surprisingly deft. The sun beat down, and a sheen of sweat covered his brow. She realized she'd been staring, and a strange, unwelcome warmth spread through her chest. She turned away quickly, her cheeks burning. Warmth was dangerous. The whispers from the town would be spreading already. She could almost hear them on the wind. A woman with a child and no husband, living with that silent man on his ranch. The words were a rope, tightening around her neck with every passing hour. She would be branded, a woman of no account, scorned. That evening she found him leaning against the fence, watching the sun bleed all over the horizon. She stood behind him, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron into knots. "They'll talk," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "They'll say I'm shameless, living here, taking your food." He didn't turn around, but she saw his profile etched against the dying light. Let them talk. The simplicity of it hit her like a punch. Let them talk, as if words weren't weapons, as if her shame was a small, insignificant thing compared to a roof over their heads and food in their bellies. She looked down at the dirt. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I've been called worse than beggar. I've been cast out." He was silent for a long moment, his arms folded across his chest. Then, so quiet she almost missed it, he said, "Every soul deserves a little warmth." The words dropped into the well of her loneliness and sent ripples all the way to the bottom. Her breath hitched. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was a fool. But something in her chest, something hard and cold she'd been carrying for years, began to melt. Just then, Cora's voice piped up from behind them. "Mama, look!" She was holding up a perfect brown egg, a triumphant grin on her face. Millie's eyes blurred. Not because of the egg, but because of the smile. It was the second time in one day. Houston didn't say anything else. He just tipped his hat as the last sliver of sun disappeared. Millie stood beside him, and for the first time, the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of something new, something fragile and dangerous and real. And she wondered, just for a second, if safety could be more than just a place to hide. That night the wind howled around the cabin, a lonely sound that slipped through the cracks in the walls. It carried a chill that felt older than the weather. Millie sat by the fire, mending a tear in Cora's dress while the child slept in her lap. Across the room, Houston was cleaning his rifle. The lamplight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The methodical scrape of oiled cloth on steel was a steady rhythm that matched the anxious beat of her own heart. Every movement he made seemed to pull her closer to a truth she wasn't ready to face. When Cora's breathing was deep and steady, Millie finally spoke. Her voice was a low, brittle thing in the quiet room. "You must wonder," she started, not looking at him, "how we ended up like this." Houston didn't stop his work. He didn't even look up, but he went still, and his stillness was a kind of listening. It was an invitation. "My husband," she said, the words catching in her throat like burrs. "His grave is 3 states back. The trail, it took him. A fever. Gone in 2 nights." Her hand trembled as she rested it on Cora's back. "He left me with a child and not a single coin to my name." She took a shaky breath. "I tried to find work. Honest work. Some folks offered bread. Most, most wanted something else in return." Her voice cracked, dropping to a whisper. "I ran before they could take it. I've been running for so long, I don't even know what I'm running from anymore. Or if I'm just wandering." The rifle clicked softly as Houston set it down. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't say he was sorry. He just leaned forward and tossed another log on the fire. Sparks flew up the chimney like a flurry of frantic birds, and in that moment, Millie understood. His silence wasn't coldness. It was a form of respect. He was giving her space to lay her burden down without judging its weight. Her eyes filled with hot, angry tears she refused to shed. "Now they'll say even worse things about me. The people in that town. They always do." Houston finally looked up, his face split by firelight and shadow. It made him look ancient and fierce. "Let them." 2 words, heavy as anvils. The room was so quiet she could hear the blood rushing in her ears. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to lean on the iron strength of those 2 words. But doubt was a serpent, coiling in her gut. Words were cheap. What would happen when the town came for her? Because they would. They always did. She didn't have to wait long to find out. A week later, she walked into the general store, Cora's hand in hers, clutching the list of supplies and the coins Houston had given her. The bell above the door jangled, and every conversation in the store stopped dead. Heads turned, eyes stared. The whispers weren't even whispers anymore. "That's her," a woman by the pickle barrel said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Living out at his place. No shame at all." Another woman smirked. "Her kind always lands on their feet, don't they?" Millie's face was on fire. She kept her eyes locked on the sack of flour on the shelf, her hands shaking as she pointed. Cora pressed against her leg, sensing the hostility in the air, like a change in the weather. Millie wanted to run, just grab her daughter and flee back to the silence of the cabin, but her feet felt like they were nailed to the floor. Then the door opened behind her. The sound of heavy boots on the floorboards was unmistakable. She knew who it was without even turning around. Houston stepped past her. His shadow fell across the counter, and his presence seemed to suck all the air out of the room. He didn't say a word. He just picked up the sack of flour she'd paid for, took her by the arm, and guided her out the door. As he passed the women, he let his gaze sweep over them. It was cold and flat and hard, and their voices withered and died in their throats. His silence was a shout. Outside, in the dusty street, Millie's breath came in ragged gasps. "You shouldn't have," she whispered. "I will," he cut in, his voice leaving no room for argument. The heavy sack of flour swung from his hand as if it weighed nothing. His other hand stayed on her arm, steady and warm, until the shaking finally stopped. That night, for a few precious minutes, things felt almost normal. Cora laughed as Houston showed her how to scatter grain for the chickens. But joy, Millie was learning, was a fleeting guest. By evening, Cora was burning with fever. The world tilted and spun. Terror, cold and sharp, clawed its way up Millie's throat. She knelt by the cot, pressing a damp cloth to her daughter's forehead, her lips moving in frantic, broken prayers. Houston was a rock in the storm. He never left their side. He brought cool water. He kept the fire fed. He sat for hours just holding Cora's tiny hot hand in his own massive one, as if he could pour his own strength into her. The night stretched on, thin and brittle. Millie found herself watching him as much as she watched her daughter. Her heart was being torn in two by fear for her child and this strange, terrifying awe for this silent man. In the deepest, darkest hour of the night, when the fever was at its worst, she finally broke. "If she dies," she whispered, her voice shattering into a million pieces, "I'll have nothing left." Houston didn't answer right away. He just gently brushed his thumb over the back of Cora's hand. It was a gesture of such profound tenderness, it seemed impossible from a man so hard. Then he spoke, his voice rough with a certainty that defied logic. "She won't." Millie stared at him, a wild, desperate question in her eyes. How could he know? What right did he have to make such a promise to a universe that had never shown them any mercy? But his face, illuminated by the dying fire, held no arrogance, only a fierce, stubborn belief. She clung to that belief because it was all she had left. Dawn came, a slow, gray creep across the cabin floor. Cora stirred. Her breathing was easier. Her skin was cool and damp. The fever had broken. Relief washed over Millie in a wave so powerful it buckled her knees. She bowed her head over the cot and wept. Silent, gut-wrenching sobs of gratitude and exhaustion. Houston stood up, went outside, and came back with a handful of small purple wildflowers. He laid them on the pillow next to Cora's head. When Millie finally looked up, her face streaked with tears, she whispered the first real words of thanks she'd ever spoken to him. "You saved her." He just shook his head. "She saved herself. I only kept her company." But Millie knew better. He hadn't just kept her company. He had stood guard against the dark. He had given them more than shelter, more than food. He had given them a sliver of hope in a world that had offered none. That night she sat on the porch, staring up at the cold, distant stars. Her chest felt raw, like it had been torn open and crudely stitched back together. Houston's shadow fell across the doorway. She didn't have to turn around to know he was there. Her hand came up, pressing against her own heart, as if to calm its frantic rhythm. Something was growing in the silence between them, something that bound them closer than shared hardship, closer than the scorn of the town. And for the first time, Millie allowed herself to feel the edges of what he had offered her on that train platform. Safety. It was a dangerous, fragile thing, and she was terrified of it. But for the first time, she was also starting to believe it might be real. A fragile peace settled over the cabin in the days after Cora's fever broke. But it was the kind of peace that comes before a storm, when the air is thick and heavy and still. Millie moved with a new sense of purpose, her hands finding a rhythm in the daily chores. She was still afraid, but it was a different kind of fear now. It wasn't the fear of starvation. It was the fear of losing this. The town, however, had a long memory and a sharp tongue. When she returned to the store, the whispers were gone. In their place were open stares and words spoken loud enough to be heard across the street. "That's Houston's woman," a ranch hand said to his friend, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that landed dangerously close to her skirt. "Bold as you please, living in sin right under our noses." The words were meant to burn, and they did. In this town, a woman's reputation was all she had, and hers was in ashes. She walked with her back straight, Cora's hand a small, warm anchor in her own. Each step was an act of war. Soon the taunts escalated. As she was leaving the store, a broad, fleshy man named Jed blocked her path. His grin was greasy. "Playing house with the silent man, are we?" he sneered. "Don't get too comfortable, girlie. Men like him, they get tired of strays eventually." Millie's blood ran cold, but she met his gaze. "Step aside." He laughed, a loud, ugly sound. "Oh, I think not. A desperate woman like you, you'll learn to take what's offered. Maybe you should start practicing with me." His hand shot out, grabbing her arm. Before she could even scream, Houston was there. He moved without a sound, a phantom of vengeance. He didn't touch Jed. He didn't say a word. He just stood between them, his eyes locked on the hand that was gripping her arm. He just stared. And under the weight of that silent, deadly gaze, Jed's bravado crumbled. The hand fell away. He muttered something under his breath and scurried away like a rat. Millie's knees were shaking. Houston didn't look at her. He just took the sack of supplies from her hand and started walking toward home, his quiet presence a shield around her. That night, she found him by the fire trying to mend a tear in her dress. His big, clumsy fingers fumbled with the needle and thread, but his jaw was set in a line of pure, stubborn concentration. The sight of it broke something inside her. No man had ever fought for her honor. And here was one who faced down bullies by day and clumsily stitched her worn-out dress by night. Words swelled in her chest, but they caught in her throat. She turned away before he could see the tears in her eyes, burying her face in Cora's sleeping hair. In the days that followed, the town grew colder. The stairs were like ice. But Millie felt a new strength growing inside her. Houston's silence was no longer a mystery. It was a fortress, and she was living inside its walls. Dignity wasn't something you begged for. It was something you built, one quiet act of defiance at a time. But the world wasn't done testing her. One evening, as the sun was setting the prairie ablaze, Millie went to the well. As she lowered the bucket, a voice slithered out of the shadows behind the barn. "Well now, look at the pretty little mouse, all alone." It was Jed. She stiffened, her hand tightening on the rope. "You have no business here." He laughed and stepped into the dying light. "I have business wherever I please. You really think that mute is going to keep you forever? Men get bored. You better start learning how to please the rest of us for when he throws you out." He lunged, his hand clamping down on her arm like a manacle. The bucket dropped, clattering against the stones of the well. Terror, sharp and metallic, flooded her mouth. Then a voice cut through the air, low and cold as a razor. "Let go!" Jed spun around. Houston stood 10 paces away, a dark silhouette against the fiery sky. He wasn't moving, but his stillness was more threatening than any weapon. "She's going to be nothing but trouble for you, Houston," Jed stammered, his greasy smile faltering. He still had his hand on Millie's arm. "Let go," Houston repeated. The words were flat, final, an order, not a request. Jed's hand dropped. He backed away, spitting curses, and disappeared into the growing darkness. Houston's eyes never left the spot where he had vanished. Millie's breath was coming in ragged sobs. She gripped the edge of the well, her knuckles white. Houston moved closer, his hand hovering near her elbow, not touching, but waiting. When she didn't pull away, his fingers gently closed around her arm, steadying her. "They'll never stop," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Men like him, the whispers, it'll never end." His jaw was a hard line in the twilight, but when he looked at her, his eyes were unexpectedly soft. "Then we'll outlast them." "We," the word echoed in the shattered quiet of her heart. "Will outlast them." Not a promise of a fight, a promise of endurance. Together. That dangerous feeling of safety trembled inside her again, no longer a stranger, but a fragile, budding hope. Later that night, Millie couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. Across the room, Houston lay on his bedroll by the door, his rifle within easy reach. Cora muttered something in her sleep, and Millie reached out to soothe her. When she looked up, Houston's eyes were open. He was watching her from the shadows. Neither of them spoke, but in the charged silence, 1,000 unsaid things passed between them. The fire burned down to glowing embers. The prairie night pressed in on the small cabin. And Millie knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that survival was no longer the question. The question was what came after. The real storm broke a few nights later. It came out of nowhere, a furious explosion of thunder and lightning that seemed intent on tearing the sky apart. Rain hammered the roof of the cabin like 1,000 angry fists. Millie sat by the hearth, holding Cora tight. The little girl whimpered with every crack of thunder. Millie whispered soothing words, but her own heart was racing. Storms like this. They dredged up old memories. Memories of being alone, cold and abandoned to the whims of a cruel world. Houston moved through the cabin, a calm, steady presence in the chaos. He barred the door, his broad shoulders eclipsing the firelight. When he turned, his eyes found hers across the room, and in their depths, she saw something more than just calm. She saw a storm that mirrored the one outside, a tempest of unspoken feelings that took her breath away. He crossed the room and knelt in front of them. His voice was a low rumble, just beneath the roar of the thunder. "You're safe here." The words should have been a comfort, but they felt like a challenge. "Safe never lasts," she whispered, the truth of her life a bitter taste in her mouth. His gaze didn't waver. His hand, calloused and rough from a lifetime of hard labor, reached for her. It hovered for a second, a silent question. When she didn't flinch, his fingers gently closed around her arm. His touch was a warm, solid anchor in the swirling chaos of her fear. "Millie," he said. Her name on his lips sounded like a prayer he'd been holding back for months. "I brought you here to keep you safe. That was all. But somewhere in the silence, somewhere along the way, I started to need you here." His voice, usually so steady, cracked on the last word. "I love you." The confession stole the air from her lungs. Love? It was a word from a different life, a different world. For so long, every kindness had been a transaction. Every promise had a hidden price tag. She searched his face, looking for the lie, for the angle. But there was nothing, just raw, terrifying honesty. Her own lips trembled. The storm raging outside was nothing compared to the one that had just broken inside her chest. She raised a shaking hand and touched his cheek. The feel of his rough skin under her palm was the most real thing she had felt in years. "You gave us more than food," she whispered, her voice breaking. "More than a roof. You gave us back our dignity. You made us feel worthy." The tears she'd held back for so long finally came, hot and cleansing. "And I love you too." Between them, Cora stirred. She lifted her sleepy head and looked from her mother's tear-streaked face to the solid man kneeling before them. "Are we home now, Mama?" she asked, her small voice a fragile question against the thunder. Houston's arm came around both of them, pulling them into an embrace that felt stronger than the cabin walls, stronger than the storm, stronger than the whole cruel world. "Yes, little one," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're home. Forever." The storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, something new and fragile and beautiful had taken root. It wasn't a promise made before a preacher or written on a piece of paper. It was a vow forged in silence and fear and fire. It was the quiet, unshakable truth of three broken souls finding their way home to each other. Millie cried, but for the first time in a very long time, they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, tears that washed away the dust of the road and the shame of the past. The fire hissed as a stray drop of rain found its way down the chimney. Outside, the world was fury and chaos. But inside, there was peace. The kind of peace that comes after the battle is finally, truly over. Before you go, if you enjoyed this story, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And drop a comment below letting me know where in the world you're listening from tonight. I'd love to know how far this story has traveled.